I'm just going to, again, for any of you who have just dialed in, I'm just going to give everyone another minute or two to join. I can see people starting to roll in now. Welcome. I know it's always tricky to have, the event start right on the hour. We'll give attendees one more minute. We'll start in a minute. So those of you who are dialing in, welcome. If you need, take advantage of the minute that you have. You can see everyone starting to roll in. Welcome. All right, as people continue to roll in, welcome to IAB Canada's 2021 Digital for Reach event. We're going to get things started. We have a packed conversation for all of you today. So with that, things are and have been continue to change rapidly, and that's great news for digital media advertising. Throughout the pandemic, we saw a significant shift to digital expenditures as the market was looking for flexibility in their investments. In the meantime, we have also seen a tremendous amount of innovation across channels that have opened the pipelines to the holy grail of advertising, reach. Getting in front of addressable audiences is something that we have taken for granted for almost 25 years. And last year, the industry was out on notice. Third-party data would no longer be informing bid requests, and first parties would have to work harder to establish opt-in relationships with their customer base, which brings us to the perfect storm of today. Today, we will delve into the state of cookie independence from the perspective of reach and how to get it when the world has turned upside down. And as important as reach is to obtain within our campaigns, so too is its significance in a day-to-day context. By reaching out to fellow colleagues and friends within the industry, we stay connected. And in the name of reach, I invite you to attend the 2 exciting networking breaks that we have built into the day, so that you may reach out to old acquaintances, perhaps meet a few ones along the way, and I really hope to see you there. My name is Laura Farron. I am the Senior Director with IAB Canada, and I will be your MC for the rest of today. We, as I mentioned, have a packed agenda with some incredible speakers to unpack really interesting topics. So I do want to get started, but first, a few key housekeeping items. I invite you to take advantage of the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Time permitting, we will get to them at the end of each presentation, but overall, I really encourage you to get involved in the conversation. The presentation recordings will be made available to everyone at the end of the week and will be shared in a follow-up email. In the unlikely chance that you lose connection, just simply log in again using the original Zoom link that you were sent. Also, in the name of diversity and inclusion, we are doing our best. IAB Canada is doing our best to help secure a diverse range of speakers, but there is still work to be done. Please join us to help create change in our industry, to continue to create change in our industry by getting involved in our diversity, equality, and inclusion working group. Lastly, I would like to give a tremendous thank you to our sponsors for their support and participation in today's Reach event. Our elite corporate sponsor, the Globe and Mail, our platinum sponsors, Quantcast and Tees, our networking sponsor, MIQ, our topic sponsors, Zephyr, our prize sponsors, which will be announced throughout the day, so don't miss it. Our prizes are brought to you by Bell Media, Samsung Ads, and Tremor Video. With that, to start, let's go back to the very beginning and take a look at first-party data and its importance in a cookieless world. Here to discuss the importance of consented first-party audiences is Seth Forman, Head of Global Publisher Platforms at Quantcast. Welcome, Seth. I turn things over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Laura. If we could go to the next slide, please. Perfect. Yeah, well, let me introduce myself again. My name is Seth Forman. I'm the head of Global Publisher Platforms at Quantcast. It's great to be here. Thank you to IB Canada for having me kick off the Digital for Reach event this afternoon. We're going to hear from a lot of thought leaders and really fantastic speakers around navigating through all these different major hurdles that we're going through as an industry, including privacy regulations and all the evolving nature towards the advertising and measurement ecosystem. But to jump right in, over the next 15 minutes, I'll be sharing important context around what we've learned at Quantcast from operating our own advertising platform and our own consent management platform, so that the audience can come away with some best practices and ultimately better prepare for what lies ahead in the cookieless, privacy-first world. Next slide, please. Okay. Thank you for building that. So a little bit about Quantcast, just a couple minutes. For those not familiar with our company, Quantcast has been around since 2006. We're a global advertising technology company, best known for helping both publishers and marketers with both measurement and advertising. We do everything within a privacy compliance nature, and we also operate our own consent management platform called Quantcast Choice. But most importantly, in terms of our vision for Quantcast and for the industry, is the champion of free and open internet, where we want to help both sides, publishers, marketers, and also consumers, being able to have an equitable value and relationship across the industry, so that we can have this sustainable free and open internet. Next slide. So ultimately, what does a free and open internet mean for an industry that has profound concern around consumer privacy? And it's a really important question that I think a lot of us in the industry are thinking about. And I do want to spend a few minutes around the key events that led us to this point. So if we go to the next slide. And when you think back, privacy and in general, and particularly online privacy, has been certainly been around for decades. But when you think about a pivotal event that created tremendous awareness about the issue around consumer privacy, I think one of those events goes back to 2013, when we saw Edward Snowden, an NSA analyst who leaked classified information about different surveillance programs that the US government was using, both domestically and internationally. And it created I think a sense around with people around the world of this idea of who's looking behind my shoulder, what controls do I have, and a lot of questions around just privacy in general. It really kick-started a lot of this discussion about consumer privacy. And if we go to the next slide. The next event that, really took things to the next level, so to speak, was the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which Cambridge Analytica was a third-party vendor of Facebook. They were using millions and millions of Facebook profiles for political reasons, but the issue really came about where there really wasn't that consumer consent, and a lot of people on Facebook were just unaware of the use of their data for purposes that they weren't aware of, and it created a lot of uproar across publicly, and a lot of awareness on the issue, and ultimately it drove was one of many, but arguably the biggest catalyst that drove a lot of these government regulations that we're seeing around the world. In Canada, in fact, a lot of the awareness around consumer privacy continues to grow. There was some research in 2020 that showed that 74%, almost 3/4 of Canadians, have taken at least one action around their privacy protections, where we saw 59% have been restricting access to geolocation data, 57% are denying the use of personal data for advertising purposes, 49% are changing their privacy settings on accounts for their profile. So this continue, even in Canada as well. It's a major issue, and we're seeing that in the new comprehensive consumer privacy law being debated right now in Canada that potentially could be finalized next year. So this is moving. So let's go to the next slide. So there's been a lot of government response. We saw GDPR go into effect in Europe, a comprehensive opt-in privacy law, CCPA in the US, and if we go to the next slide, and just around the world, the consumer privacy regulations continues to grow. And in fact, today, Gartner put out some research showing that 10% of countries have a form of privacy laws today. By 2023, in just a couple of years, that's expected to grow to 65% of the world's population will have some personal privacy laws that they're going to be regulated under. And so globally, most people around the world are going to have privacy laws. And ultimately, this means that organizations need to adapt to these different changes. Let's go to the next slide. If you could build this, please. So, we've talked about the regulations and governments changing and adapting different privacy laws, but it's not just the governments that have been adopting laws. It's also been big tech. And for many years, Apple has been leading the way ever since 2017, when they put forth the ITP initiatives to effectively initially limit the use of third-party cookie tracking and the use of third-party cookies in general. Now it's virtually doesn't exist. So both Safari and Firefox have adopted severe limitations and restrictions around third-party cookies. And essentially, approximately about 40% of the web is effectively anonymous. There are no third-party cookies. There's no addressability. The rest of the web is generally used by Chrome. Google announced in 2020 they're going to deprecate third-party cookies next year, and they just announced they're going to delay. But it's just a delay, and which means that as an industry, we have to continue to adapt and find alternatives so that we can sustain the free and open internet. Let's go to the next slide. So what does this all mean? And as we think about as an industry, the evolving nature of where things are going, a key part of that is this essence of consented first-party audiences, and really the idea of how can you build and grow and have deeper connections with your users in a consented way. And that's something as an industry is becoming more and more important, and the companies that can grow their first-party audiences, ideally in a consented way, are the ones that are going to be more successful in the future. And we see this in many cases with the walled gardens, Google, Facebook, Amazon. They have scaled direct consumer relations that they own their own inventory and their own ad tech. They have tremendous advantages. And so it's really important for the open web to create and find viable alternatives to better compete with the walled gardens, and ultimately finding a path where the consumers also have a say in that and have the ability for choice around their consent and use of data. Let's go to the next slide. You can build that, yeah, thanks. So we do want to spend a couple minutes on the changes with cookies, because it's important context to where we're going. So when you think about the world of today and the use of third-party cookies, the advantage of third-party cookies is that it gives both publishers and marketers this visibility across the consumer journey, because third-party cookies allow the ability to understand audiences, show ads, sell something, and ultimately providing that dotted line and those connections across the entire journey. Marketers ultimately can see a full funnel to be able to determine whether the targeting and measurement is effective. Now, if you go to the next slide, please, this in a way falls apart when you remove third-party cookies, because in the first-party cookie world, every first-party cookie is on a single domain, so there's no way to actually connect the dots on a marketing campaign. And so ultimately, if you could keep building that, please. Oh, if you go back one, yeah, that's good. So ultimately what that means is it creates a lot of disruption and a lot of challenges in a world without third-party cookies to ultimately continue to operate and manage your different advertising campaigns. And so if you go to the next slide, the way that Quantcast is thinking about the future and the industry as well, go to the next slide, please. Yeah. Is really an essence in which, you know, we believe that there's a lot of approaches that need to be looked at and explored to find a viable path and a viable way forward. This includes independent identifiers like UID, which is really based upon email as the main identifier, ideally consented emails, but it's really that essence of emails. Cohorts, which are effectively the idea of aggregating behavioral data together into groups of into cohorts and targeting them. Google's FLoC initiatives have been driving this. It's still in its early stages, more privacy friendly than individualized targeting, but still a lot of questions remain around how this is ultimately going to look like once this development continues. But it still is in a potential approach. There's contextual. Contextual's been around for a long time. The idea of looking at the content of a page and providing data on the content of a page. There's been a lot of advancements with contextual. It's getting more and more technically advanced, but still it's a potential alternative. And then you have first-party data, which is really being driven directly from publishers using their content, using potentially hashed emails, and ways that they could use their own first-party data for alternative identifiers. Go to the next slide, please. So to kind of simplify this further, you know, we look at really what we call our 3 I's in order to really think about and approach a world without third-party cookies. And it starts with industry standards. So the IB Canada, and just participating and listening to a lot of what your associations are doing is a really important step. Getting involved with Project Rearc, involved with Pre-Bid, W3C, all these associations are trying to come together to find viable paths forward, and being part of it and listening to what's going on in these associations is really important. Interoperability is really the essence of being able to partner and interoperate across platforms or channels based on these different identifiers in your own systems. Unified ID, LiveRamp, Google FLoC, all these different identifiers, you know, being able to interoperate with them is going to be important in the future. And then innovation is really down to the idea where, as I mentioned earlier, we have all these signals and all these different ways in the future in order to understand and collect data and use it. So how do you make sense of it all? And that's where machine learning and AI comes in. So you can take all these signals, ultimately work with your different partners on the marketing side and the publisher side to help them achieve their goals. And we're going to go a step next slide, please. And so going a step further, it's, you know, when we talk about multiple signals, you know, the data signals could come from contextual and first party and cohorts, a lot of different identifiers from time, language. So there's a lot of ways in the future how we're going to be able to find these signals and ultimately be able to run our campaigns. But a key essence, and the key one in here is the orange one, is consent. how do you do all this in a consent-first world? And a key piece of that is being able to operate in all these different regions of the world and countries of the world, and ensuring that you're obeying the laws of that land. You know, if you're operating in Europe under GDPR, ensuring that you have opt-in consent, or you have if you need a consent management platform, ideally one that's part of the IAB framework, so that you're receiving that consent, passing that consent, and being able to use these different signals where consumers have that ability to say yes or no. And other countries in the world, like in the US, where you have CCPA in California, which is an opt-out law, so do you have consent in place to be able to have consumers to opt out of that consent, to opt out of their data being used. And so ensuring that you're within the laws of the land is very important. Go to the next slide. So consent, as I mentioned, super important. We've seen a lot of quotes here. You know, this is, the left quote is from an executive at a publisher who said, the first thing I'm asking when an identity vendor walks through the door is, do they have the permission to do the things they say they do? And on the right, an agency privacy executive said that I am very interested to see an ID solution that works with consent, because I haven't seen one that fully answers that yet. So both of those questions are important and are going to continue to become more and more questions that come up in different meetings, because consent is key. The consumer, in many ways, has not had the ability to choose their use of their data for many, many years, and that's why we're seeing all these different privacy laws come into effect. And so ensuring that your business is complying with laws of that country is incredibly important, or even going a step further and going beyond, in some cases, what the law states. And an example of that is if you're collecting emails from users, are you explaining to your users, getting that consent, and also explaining what you're doing with those users and with your data? And are the purposes that you're collecting their email being stated to them up front? So those things really drive connections, trust, and relationships with your customer base. Next slide. So wrapping up here, how do we prepare? I think number one, review your consent and data privacy is critical. It's really building that foundation. And what we mean by that is, does your business have a map of your data? Have you mapped out all of the third parties using your data, all of the incoming data, the data that's being exported? Has that been mapped out in your organization? Because if it hasn't, that's a really important priority, because no matter what the Canadian law looks like or what other regional laws around the world look like, if you have that map, that's a foundational layer and that first step you should have when you're thinking about preparing for the future. Two, focus on compliant first-party data collection. Again, this is about, are you getting consent where you need consent? Are you following the rules of that land, which is really, really important in terms of the global aspect. In the US, it's only going to get more and more complicated. In the US, you have 20 different states that are looking at a variety of different data privacy laws. So, depending where you operate, it is only going to get more and more complex, but you have to ensure that you're compliant, especially with that first-party data collection. And finally, about testing, there's so many identifiers out there, but we can't emphasize enough the importance of testing different approaches. If you're not testing, you stay on the sidelines, which many people are doing, you're not going to get those learnings, and you may not see those new opportunities and be able to act as things evolve. Whereas the ones that are testing can be that a step ahead. And even if that's just carving out a small test budget to test a new identifier, you can get so many learnings for that to help you prepare for the future. All right, next slide. So, the fact is that the open web is paid for by advertising. And there's a lot of research that shows that addressability and addressable advertising has far higher CPMs, far better monetization. And a lot of that is changing right now. So as an industry, it's more important than ever that we find alternatives to third-party cookies and paths that also ensure that the consumer is also part of that journey, and that the consumers have that choice, and consumers have the ability to be part of the value opportunity and the value chain of where we're going as an industry. And if we're able to do that, that's a sustainable path for a free and open internet. So thank you very much. Let's go to the last slide here. Yeah, thanks so much for your time. I have my email address. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm not sure if we have any time for questions, or how are we doing on time?
We do, Seth. Yeah, we do have some time. So for those of you who have dialed in, please just populate your questions into the Q&A. Thank you, Seth. I mean, that's a lot to take in, but it's all really important to take in. Your point about, which will win, the one size does not fit all. I think that when we put that in the context of reach, it's important to think about all solutions that exist and test all of them kind of alongside of one another. So one question I got specifically is from a marketer, and I think you've alluded to this with your kind of 3 things to think about, but the question is, as a marketer, where do I start, and what should testing look like?
So it's a good question. Where do you start? I think it's thinking about and strategizing around, number one, looking internally. If you're starting from a privacy sense, the question is more around privacy related, talking to consent management platforms, talking to, again, I talked about, mapping out your own data assets. There's a big push around first-party data, ensuring that you are broadening your ability to collect first-party data. So I think part of it is just your own internal systems that you want in place. As you think about testing with vendors, I think it's really having conversations with some of your partners that you ideally already work with, asking them around, hey, what is your cookieless strategy? Asking questions around what their plans are. And ultimately, if that vendor does have a plan in place that also meets your objectives, then being able to carve out a small test budget, aligning on the goals of that campaign, ensuring that there's proper measurement, and running a test, and start with just one, see how that goes. Maybe it's a testing contextual, maybe it's a test around UID. Quantcast is testing a number of different cookieless initiatives, and then starting small, growing, and measuring and going from there.
Yeah, well said. I will also add, and I will include this in the chat, that IAB Canada has been building out information specific to CMPs as well. So thank you for bringing that in, Seth. I'll be sure to include that link in the chat. We have time for one more question. In your opinion, and it's specific to testing, in your opinion, what are the key identifiers to test if you had a limited budget?
The key identifiers, I would say that it's more, at this point, we're still in very early stages, particularly testing in cookieless environments. I think it's really about being able to understand, and the other advantage to today is that third-party cookies are still around. So what's the opportunity in today's environment, and now until 2023 at least, is that we can test where you can test, you could carve out some budget, you could test a cookieless campaign, and then you could also test that against and measure it against a third-party cookie campaign. So you could test it against each other. I would say that's an important part. But so in terms of identifiers, ensuring that however you measure conversions through whatever use of third-party cookies, you could do the same with a cookieless test, and effectively measuring the two together.
Yeah, well said. Well, thank you, Seth, for joining us today. That was very informative. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura. Appreciate it. And thanks again for having us on.
Thank you for joining us. Up next, it is my pleasure to welcome John Burke. He's the VP Product Team with Zephyr. John is here to break down the importance of leveraging contextual